The Biden administration used TPS to allow large numbers of illegal aliens, Venezuelans, and Haitians to remain in the U.S. since most of these individuals likely did not enter the U.S. lawfully or qualify for asylum.
It's definitely plausible. In fact, there was designations at the beginning of his term, and then they backdated and extended the dates after they'd let all those people in. So it's very
right. I mean, impeached Secretary Mayorkas blew our borders wide open by exploiting asylum and parole. It's fairly well documented. And in my view, breaking the law in doing so. I would think it's well within the realm of possibilities that TPS was also abused to shield those released illegal aliens from deportation, right?
That's definitely plausible.
So, and it just wasn't Haiti and Venezuela, right? Mayorkas and Biden used TPS to shield upwards of 700,000 illegal aliens from Afghanistan, Burma, Cameroon, El Salvador, Ethiopia.
You just witnessed a crystallization of the entire rotted architecture of contemporary right-wing propaganda, and you need to understand what actually happened here, because this is about power, and who gets to be considered human, and the stakes are nothing less than whether we build a multiracial democracy or descend into authoritarian ethnic nationalism. Chip Roy just sat before cameras accusing the impeached Secretary Mayorkas of blowing the border wide open through exploitation of temporary protected status. And what you need to understand is that every single syllable of this performance was designed to activate the most primal xenophobic circuits in the American imagination, while clothing naked cruelty in the stolen vestments of law and order. And you better believe that what we are watching is the deliberate construction of a narrative that treats human beings fleeing violence and catastrophe as invaders to be repelled, rather than refugees entitled to protection under both domestic and international law. Let me tell you what temporary protected status actually is, because this matters and the truth matters even when fascists are screaming lies into microphones. The federal government offers TPS to qualifying immigrants who live in the U.S. and come from selected nations that are deemed unsafe to return to because of war, natural disasters, or other crises. And this is not some radical innovation cooked up by Biden in a basement somewhere, but rather a program that Congress and President George H.W. Bush authorized in the 1990 immigration law, which means that when Roy screams about lawbreaking, he is actually describing the lawful execution of congressionally mandated humanitarian protection, and when he invokes the specter of 700,000 people from countries experiencing unimaginable violence and suffering, you need to ask yourself what kind of moral universe he inhabits, where offering temporary sanctuary to human beings is characterized as a betrayal, rather than the most basic expression of our commitments under refugee law. And here is where it gets absolutely explosive, because you need to understand the conditions that triggered these TPS designations in the first place. The TPS extension for Haiti cited the country's simultaneous economic, security, political, and health crises, and when you look at the actual situation on the ground, gangs run 80% of Port-au-Prince and are known for using systemic rape, brutal murder, and kidnapping to control the terrorized and starving Haitians who were unable to flee the country, which means that what Roy characterizes as abuse is actually the application of humanitarian protection to people who would face certain death if returned. The Biden administration cited dangerous conditions in Cameroon, Myanmar, Syria, and Venezuela when it recently expanded TPS protections to immigrants from those countries, because these are not arbitrary decisions, but responses to documentable catastrophes that meet the statutory criteria Congress itself established. Now hold on, because we need to talk about Venezuela specifically, since Roy is so exercised about Venezuelans, and here is what actually happened. Under Biden, the Pew Research Center estimates nearly 1.2 million non-citizen immigrants, out of a total of 21.6 million in the U.S., became eligible for TPS. And yes, that is an expansion, but you know what else was expanding? The humanitarian crisis in Venezuela, where an authoritarian regime has presided over economic collapse and political persecution, that has driven millions to flee, and the State Department's travel advisory for U.S. citizens interested in traveling to Venezuela is Level 4 Do Not Travel, which means that even the United States government acknowledges that Venezuela is so dangerous that Americans should not go there, but somehow Roy wants us to believe that forcing Venezuelans who are already here to return to those conditions is the enforcement of law rather than the infliction of cruelty. But wait, because the hypocrisy gets even more breathtaking when you understand what actually happened with the Mayorkas impeachment, because this was not about law enforcement but about political theater. Mayorkas faced 2 articles of impeachment arguing that he willfully and systematically refused to enforce existing immigration laws and that he breached the public trust by lying to Congress and saying the border was secure, but critics said the charges amount to a policy dispute over Biden's border policy, hardly rising to the Constitution's bar of high crimes and misdemeanors, and Mayorkas is the first cabinet member to be impeached since William Belknap, Secretary of War under President Ulysses S. Grant, in 1876, which means that Republicans reached back nearly 150 years to find a precedent for what Democrats dismissed as a stunt and a sham that could set a chilling precedent for other civil servants snared in policy disputes by lawmakers who disagree with the president's approach, and think about what that means for the future of democratic governance, when cabinet officials can be impeached simply for implementing the policies of the administration they serve. And here is the part that should make your blood absolutely boil, because while Roy sits there pontificating about law and order, Mayorkas wrote in a letter to the committee that it should be working with the Biden administration to update the nation's broken and outdated immigration laws for the 21st century, an era of record global migration, saying we need a legislative solution, and only Congress can provide it, which means that the very body accusing Mayorkas of lawlessness is the same body that has refused for decades to update our immigration system and has instead weaponized dysfunction to create crises they can then blame on Democratic administrations. Trump, on the campaign trail and in private talks, has tried to squelch the deal, referring to bipartisan border legislation, because Republicans do not actually want solutions, they want campaign issues, and human suffering is simply fuel for their political machinery. Now let us talk about what Chip Roy actually believes, because this is not just about TPS, but about a comprehensive vision of ethnic nationalism that he is working to implement. Roy asserted that all immigrants in the country who entered illegally must be deported, and has also called for closing the country to legal immigration until undocumented immigrants are deported, and Roy introduced the Pause Act, which would freeze all immigration to the U.S., except for temporary tourist visas, until certain conditions are met, noting that our nation's foreign-born population has reached 51.9 million, comprising over 15% of our total population, a near record high. And when you read that, you need to understand that Roy is not describing a crisis, but rather demographic change that he finds threatening. Roy says we have millions of people in our country that are not seeking to assimilate, not seeking to be the quote melting pot, but rather are trying to kind of re-establish their cultures from other countries here, rather than becoming fully American, which is just blood and soil nationalism with a Texas accent. And this brings us to the fundamental lie at the heart of Roy's entire performance, which is the claim that the Biden administration was breaking the law when, in fact, once the Department of Homeland Security determines that a nation's immigrants are eligible for TPS, those immigrants can apply for deportation relief if they entered the U.S. without authorization or entered on a temporary visa that has since expired, which means that TPS is specifically designed to provide protection to people regardless of how they entered, and to be granted TPS, applicants must meet filing deadlines, pay a fee, and prove they have lived in the U.S. continuously since the events that triggered relief from deportation, which means there are actual eligibility requirements and vetting processes, and this is not the lawless free-for-all that Roy describes, but rather the execution of a statute that Congress itself wrote. But here is what really exposes the game, because Roy keeps talking about illegal aliens being shielded from deportation, as if that is some kind of scandal when in fact, once granted TPS, an individual also cannot be detained by DHS on the basis of his or her immigration status in the United States, because that is literally the point of the program. Under temporary protected status, immigrants are eligible for work authorization and cannot be deported from the United States on the basis of their immigration status, which means that Roy is characterizing the intended legal effects of a statute as abuses of that statute, and this is like calling it a crime that someone with a driver's license is allowed to drive a car. Now we need to talk about who these people actually are, because Roy wants you to imagine an invading horde, but many of these individuals with TPS have lived in the U.S. for decades, calling this country their home, and they are contributing members of our society, including our colleagues and neighbors, and the TPS program provides them a way to support themselves, contribute to the U.S. workforce and economy, and keep their families together. An estimated 130,000 TPS holders work as essential critical infrastructure workers, with more than 94% of TPS holders in the labor force as of 2017. Which means these are people who are embedded in our communities and our economy, and who would face persecution or death if returned to their countries of origin. And the question is whether we are a nation that offers protection to the persecuted, or whether we are willing to sacrifice human beings on the altar of nativist rage. And this gets to the heart of what the parole programs were actually designed to accomplish, because Roy also attacks the use of parole, and you need to understand what that means. Since President Biden took office in 2021, His administration has used immigration parole at a historic scale, invoking the decades-old law to welcome hundreds of thousands of foreigners fleeing armed conflicts in Afghanistan and Ukraine, or political and economic crises in countries like Haiti and Venezuela. The Biden administration has argued its use of parole has allowed it to respond to emergency situations, such as the Taliban's reconquest of Afghanistan and the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and to reduce illegal crossings at the southern border by offering would-be migrants legal pathways, which means that parole was being used to create orderly processes that would reduce dangerous border crossings and provide humanitarian protection. In Section 212d5a of the Immigration and Nationality Act grants the U.S. Secretary of Homeland Security the discretionary authority to parole into the United States temporarily under such conditions as he may prescribe only on a case-by-case basis for urgent humanitarian reasons or significant public benefit, which means this is statutory authority that Congress provided. But Roy does not care about any of this because the cruelty is the point, and the dehumanization is the strategy, and when he says that any individuals who came here illegally or were released into the U.S. illegitimately, by the Harris-Biden Mayorkas regime, need to be removed, they need to be deported, he is describing mass deportation that would tear apart families and communities and return people to countries where they face persecution and death, and he is doing so while wrapping himself in the language of law and order, even as he calls for the violation of every humanitarian principle this nation claims to hold dear. And you need to understand the current political moment, because what Roy is describing is not some hypothetical future, but the agenda that the Trump administration is actively implementing right now. DHS Secretary Kristi Noem decided to terminate TPS protections for Venezuela under the 2023 designation, overturning a decision by the Biden administration to extend protections until October 2026, and although a trial court recognized that the Trump administration acted illegally in stripping hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans and Haitians of humanitarian protected status, the administration has continued to pursue termination, and more than 350,000 Haitian immigrants are set to lose temporary protected status on February 3, 2026, with DHS Secretary Noem saying there are no extraordinary and temporary conditions in Haiti preventing a safe return, and that even if there were, allowing Haitian nationals to remain in the United States was contrary to the national interest despite the documented catastrophe in Haiti. This is ethnic cleansing by bureaucratic means, and you cannot call it anything else when Trump instructed the Department of Homeland Security to terminate all categorical parole programs that are contrary to the policies of the United States, including the humanitarian parole program for Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, and since 2023, 690 people have been granted humanitarian parole, and once approved, migrants were allowed to stay in the country for up to 2 years, get a work permit, and be shielded from deportations, but now face the destruction of their lives in America and potential return to countries where they could be killed, and in recent months people have suffered unspeakable harm, including deportation and family separation, and this is the direct consequence of the rhetoric that Chip Roy is deploying in that hearing room. And we need to be absolutely clear about what is being constructed here, because this is not about border security, but about the construction of a racial other who can be blamed for every social problem and economic anxiety, and whose presence can be characterized as an existential threat to justify increasingly authoritarian measures. When Roy talks about 700,000 people being shielded from deportation, he is activating the same discursive machinery that has been used throughout American history to justify the exclusion and expulsion of racialized populations from the Chinese Exclusion Act to Operation Wetback, and the only thing that has changed is the specific targets and the specific rhetorical frames, but the underlying logic is the same, which is that there is a category of human beings whose presence is inherently illegitimate and whose suffering is either irrelevant or deserved. This is why Roy can sit there and describe people fleeing gang violence in Haiti or authoritarian persecution in Venezuela or war in Afghanistan as threats rather than as refugees, because once you construct someone as an illegal alien rather than as a human being seeking protection, then their claims to dignity and safety can be dismissed as fraud, and their use of legal processes can be characterized as exploitation, and suddenly protecting people from murder becomes blowing the border wide open, and granting work authorization to people fleeing persecution becomes shielding illegal aliens from deportation, and the entire moral architecture of refugee protection collapses into nativist paranoia. And this matters right now, because we are watching the construction of the legal and rhetorical framework for mass deportation that would be the largest forced removal of people from the United States Since the ethnic cleansing of indigenous peoples, Trump plans executive orders to seal the border shut and include mass deportation of undocumented immigrants in the United States, and Senate Republicans are planning as much as $85 billion for border security as part of an initial bill for budget reconciliation, which means they are preparing to spend obscene amounts of money to tear families apart and return people to danger, while our infrastructure crumbles, and our healthcare system fails, and our climate continues to destabilize, but somehow there is always money for cruelty, and always political will for exclusion. You need to understand that when Chip Roy accuses Mayorkas of breaking the law, what he actually means is that he does not believe that refugees have rights, and he does not believe that asylum law should be enforced, and he does not believe that the United States has obligations under international law to protect people fleeing persecution, and he is willing to use the machinery of impeachment and investigation and congressional theater to construct a narrative in which humanitarian protection is reframed as criminal conspiracy, and the people who implement congressionally mandated programs characterized as lawbreakers deserving of removal from office, and this is nothing less than the dismantling of the rule of law in service of ethnic nationalism, and we cannot let them get away with this rhetorical sleight of hand, because words matter, and frames matter, and when they call TPS, beneficiaries, illegal aliens, they are erasing the legal status that Congress granted them, and when they call humanitarian protection abuse, they are inverting the moral universe, and when they call refugees invaders, they are constructing the ideological foundation for atrocities, and we have seen this movie before, and we know how it ends, and the only question is whether we have the moral courage to name what is happening and resist it with everything we have. This is the fight of our time, because this is about whether the United States will honor its commitments to refugees and asylum seekers, or whether we will join the ranks of authoritarian states that treat migration as invasion and humanitarian protection as weakness, and this is about whether we will build a multiracial democracy that recognizes the inherent dignity of all people, regardless of where they were born, or whether we will retreat into ethnic nationalism that reserves full humanity for those who meet certain racial and cultural criteria, and Chip Roy has made his choice clear. Now we have to make ours, and the stakes could not be higher, because there are hundreds of thousands of people whose lives depend on whether we are willing to defend the principle that all human beings have the right to seek protection from persecution, and that offering that protection is not a crime, but rather the most basic expression of our humanity. The infrastructure of cruelty is being built right before our eyes, and they are telling us exactly what they plan to do, and we need to believe them and fight back with the recognition that this is not about immigration policy, but about whether we recognize each other as human beings worthy of protection and dignity, or whether we are willing to sacrifice the most vulnerable among us to the demands of nationalist reaction. This is the crisis, and this is the test, and we cannot afford to fail.